All right. All right, so we're going to start this in just a bit. I'm trying to make sure that we get the laptop and the projector kind of in the same region, so we can work both of those simultaneously. It would appear that we're having some difficulties with our computer program, but we'll work with that as that kind of clears up. So let's go ahead and get started. And what we will do is make sure that the PowerPoint is available so that folks can get access to that while we're teaching. So I'm going to pull this over to the side a little bit. Let me bring up this. So the PowerPoint will be available for folks as we go through this lesson. So let me clear up this desktop a little bit so we can talk specifically about these learning objectives. So we're going to start off having a conversation about the difficult conversations about race and racism, and how do we have those conversations, and what makes those conversations impactful. So let me do one more thing and then we'll get started. I'll give you the outline of the course for today and how we're hoping to proceed. So for those of you who are on the webinar, what you'll see are in the window here is the main video component of it, and then on the side you'll see the slides. So I'm going to show slide 1, which is our introduction. the next part of this is will be slide 2, where we will kind of talk about what you need for this class and how the class will kind of run and what you can expect in the class. Also, if you would like to chat about some of the items that we're talking about in the class, this certainly is a space to also do that. So we have quite a few things going on all at the same time. So I hope that you are able to get what you need through the class, through this course. So first of all, my name is Andre Cohen, and I'm going to try this one more time. And if that doesn't work, that's fine. So my name is Andre Cohen, and want to go over a few things on the checklist for this particular difficult conversation about race and racism. And I'd like to say that all the things that we're talking about in terms of race and racism, the principles can be applied to other disciplines. So just because we're talking about race and racism doesn't mean that we can't be or won't be talking about other things simultaneously. So that I wanted to make sure that that was clear. So as we look at other forms of oppression, be it sexism, be it GLBT issues, be it gender roles in the workplace, all of the principles that we'll be talking about in this particular session can be applied to those sessions as well, to those ideas or concepts. So I teach currently at the Adler Graduate School, or the Alfred Adler Graduate School, and many of you may know Adlerian psychology from studying it in school or as a discipline in your practice. And what I'd like to suggest, and correct me if I've oversimplified this, but really that Adlerian psychology is focused on movement forward. So we look at the root of human behavior or human motivation being safety, significance, and belonging. And we watch that unfold as people behave in the world. And so we watch this progression of people's behavior in the world. So there are other tenets that are attached to Adlerian psychology, but we'll just stop at that particular tenet. I want to talk a little bit about the webinar checklist a little bit. So first of all, please make sure that your sound is on. Obviously, if you're listening to this, you've done that. Also, you can contact us through our conference call. So I'm going to dial the conference call right now so that we get linked into that, and you can participate that way as well. And the conference call number is 651-300-5500. And I will, I'm getting on the call right now, so you'll be able to join us.
On the call, please hold while we wait for the others to join.
All right. So as other people join the call, the call will start and proceed. So you're invited to participate. There'll be on the left side of your screen, there'll be a chat room or chat button that you can engage in that way. There's some requirements for your computer that are important. So make sure you have your sound card and all that kind of stuff ready to go. So in this particular class, we will be identifying or dealing with some of this content. So first of all, in the session, we'll talk about the following content. So how to use yourself as the model for understanding or trying to advance these critical conversations, and having these difficult conversations. So let me just turn down the conference call hold music just for a second. Okay. So again, as people join, you join the conference call. So basically, talking about assessing your own comfort on talking about these issues of race and racism, talking about understanding the context of race and racism. How do you, as an individual, prepare yourself for these conversations? What are some of the ways in which oftentimes people try to avoid these conversations? And then what are some of what are the pitfalls of that? And then tips for strong leadership in discussing race and racism conversations. And then lastly, we'll talk about and give some resources for that. So we'll go ahead and get started. So one of the things that, before you even start to think about having a conversation about race and racism, you need to, within your sphere of influence, assess your ability and willingness and comfort with having these conversations around race and racism. Because if you're not comfortable, if you don't know where you're coming from or your starting place, then it certainly will be difficult for you to even engage in the opportunity to have conversations about race and racism. And why race and racism? I mean, don't we live in a post-racial society? Don't we have a black president? A lot of times, these are the caveats that people have as to why they don't need to or shouldn't talk about race and racism. And I think it's extremely a missed opportunity to express our humanity in some very profound ways. So when we think about race, or we talk about race, the way that I'd like for us to really think about this is by looking at the Ford Motor Company. So they make a very popular vehicle, and the vehicle is called a Ford F-150, the Ford F-150, and it is a truck. And because Ford is known for making that particular vehicle and that particular truck, no matter where that truck is on the planet, it is known as a Ford F-150, and is known by because of the company who makes it, right? So they call it the Ford F-150, no matter where it is on the planet. So when we talk about this idea of race, we have to recognize that race is not only just a social construct, meaning that it's been made by people, but it's been made by a very particular set of people for a very particular reason. So when we talk about this idea of race, one could ask, how many races are there? Are there 3 races? You know, is it Africanoid, Asianoid, Europoid, or I just make those terms up. But are there 3 races, or are there 3,000 races? Well, if we take a step back and talk about first the concept of race, that it is a social construct. However, it's more than just a social construct, because it is designed by governments in order to organize their populations. I know it sounds a little bit like I should be wearing a tin hat, right? No. So let's think about this. When we talk about race and ethnicity in the United States, there are some particular categories that we address when talking about race in the United States. We have, and this is according to the EEOC, or the Equal Opportunity Commission, or the federal government, if you will. And what the federal government says is that there are folks who are described by their ethnicity as being Hispanic. Now, the interesting thing about being Hispanic is that the color of one's skin doesn't play into this idea of ethnicity as it relates to the Hispanic groups. However, when we talk about this idea of ethnicity and Hispanic, race plays a part when you talk about the other categories of race. And so there is white as a race, as defined by the federal government. There is black as defined by the federal government. There is American, Indian, Alaskan Native as defined by the federal government. There is Asian as defined by the federal government of the United States. Now, why do I keep saying the federal government, and why do I keep referring to government as the placeholder for this idea of race? Well, what I will suggest to you is that the way we talk about ethnicity and race in the United States is not the same as our partners to the north in Canada, because Canada defines race in a very particular and unique way, given its context and its location and its responsibilities to its people. That being said, Canada describes race and ethnicity differently than the United States, and the United States does it differently than Mexico, and Mexico does it differently than Argentina, and Argentina does it differently than South Africa. South Africa does it differently than Brazil, and Brazil does it differently than China, and China does it differently than Indonesia, and Indonesia does it differently. So if race is a thing, if it is a biological or anthropological identity or way of being, it should be consistent with people with similar genetic makeup across the planet. However, that is not the case. So when we talk about this idea of it just being a social construct, socially is one way, but we have to understand that governments use race and ethnicity, and they're not interchangeable, but we're kind of using them similarly because that's how they're used in the United States. When we talk about this idea of race, that becomes extremely important, that it is a construct that is designed by the government to organize its people. All right. So once you're able to at least recognize your comfortability or uncomfortability with this idea of what race is, then we can actually start to have some conversations. And so here's some questions for you to ask yourself. What does your uncomfortability lead to, or what does it not lead to? And it's uncomfortable. Your uncomfortable may lead to conflict or calls for new skills that you may or may not possess, and that's fine. That's fine. That is called being vulnerable. When you don't know what to say in new particular situations, or you don't know what to do, that's a part of the human experience. When we talk about this idea of race and racism, this becomes critical, because if we can't talk about it, then we can't undo a number of the hurts that have been harmed by how governments have tried to organize and label its people. All right. So let's go down to. So often when people are out of their comfort zone, they try to avoid stuff. And I would like to suggest that all human beings try to avoid pain as much as possible. We try to stay away from pain. And so given the fact that we're trying to stay away from pain, then sometimes the things that are more difficult, or the things that require lots of effort, we stray away from, which typically does not make that thing go away. As a matter of fact, it becomes more problematic because we've shied away from those things. So I'd encourage you not to shy away from those things. And so parting to getting students ready to talk about race and racism is to first deal with your own fears and your own inadequacies. And I will tell you that one human to another human, you are already inadequate. So whatever fear you had about your inadequacy, don't worry about it, because you're inadequate. And you're only inadequate because as human beings, we can't know everything. We are not omnipresent, and we don't know everything. So um, just by that mere fact, we are inadequate. Now, the other side of that is that you can't lean on your inadequacies and say, well, I just can't do it because I'm inadequate, because that would be disingenuous, right? So that's not actually telling the truth, if you will, of your abilities, because you have the ability to adapt and to grow and to change. And so we have to get the courage to kind of stand up and have these conversations. So here's a simple assessment that I want you to try, and just ask yourself these questions. And so it's also very important to understand context, right? So even as you're doing this this assessment on your ability to talk about race and racism, it's also equally important to understand the context, and that you come from a context, and that context limits your ability to know everything, right? So you were born in a particular geographic place at a particular corporeal time. You had a certain use of space that you were allowed to operate in, and so all of those things help to shape your worldview and your paradigm, if you will. And so when we consider, I want you to consider your context, where you've come from, how you've been raised, and understand that that is what it is, right? It's not good or bad, but it certainly gives you a set of lenses by which you see the world. And so as you think about the self-assessment about talking about race and racism, consider which of these statements are most true about you, about how you feel when it comes to talking about race and racism. The first statement is, I would rather not talk about race and racism because it causes people harm, right? So that's often something that folks will say. Other folks may say, I'm very uncomfortable when the topic of racism is brought up. I am somewhat uncomfortable talking about race and racism. I'm often uncomfortable talking about race and racism. I'm usually uncomfortable talking about racism, and I'm very comfortable talking about race and racism. And so, one might ask the question, given all of those, those questions, and obviously those were from, least responsive to most responsive, or least open to most open, why is this even a difficult conversation in the first place? Well, going back to what I talked about in terms of race, particularly in the United States, we've grown up in a racialized society, meaning that race plays a major part of every interaction that one has in this particular republic. And so when I say that, what I mean is that because of the foundation of this country, and the way that we interpreted seeing the world and seeing the people who participate in this great republic, we then have a particular way of interacting with folks. And so the hard part about talking about race and racism should be asked. That's a question we should ask. We also should ask, what is the beneficial part of talking about race and racism? So what's difficult about it, but also what's important to talk, why is that important to talk about? And your reflection should lead you to a number of additional thoughts about how you think you should engage in this conversation of race and racism. And so as you start to think about what those additional points might be, it's important that you recognize a few things. And one of which is that you prepare yourself specifically for having conversations about race and racism. And, oftentimes people don't have conversations about race and racism because they feel ill prepared. They don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. They're not sure about how they'll respond or how other people will respond to them. And so what I'd like to suggest is commit yourself to learning about race and racism, particularly if you have students or clients or coworkers that come from a particular background. Google and Wikipedia, although not scientifically proven as great resources, but they certainly will lead you on a path that will help you garner up what you think you know about people. And actually, it may in fact dispel some things that you have learned that are inaccurate about human beings. So I find it interesting that when we talk about, race and racism, and oftentimes people feel ill prepared to even have those conversations. I wonder why that is, right? Because if all human behavior is purposeful, and I'm not using or I haven't learned about a set of skills or behavior, is it possible that I don't necessarily see them as purposeful, or I've not found a purpose for those behaviors? Just a question. Something that I think is interesting is that I personally have never been set on fire. I've never been set on fire, but I know exactly what to do if I find myself in a situation. If I find myself in a situation that is, I find myself in a situation that is one where I would find myself on fire, right? So I don't know, if anybody in the audience grew up in the 70s, but we certainly had this thing called stop, drop, and roll. And stop, drop, and roll was practiced, it was talked about, it was handled and dealt with as a tool for the event that you caught on fire, right? So as a small kid, we learned this, we practiced this. And so this idea of fire drills and avoiding poisons, these are all things that we practice just in case we ran into those things. And so what I like to say is that we failed to provide the same attention to the topic of diversity, race, and racism. Our best defense in fighting racism is being offensive, and I don't mean so the best defense is a good offense, meaning that the more you know about a topic, the better you'll be prepared to deal with it and acknowledge it with knowledge and confidence. And so those things become important. When and so one of the things that people do because they don't feel confident is that they avoid having conversations about race and racism. And the problem with that method, or the lack of method of dealing with race and racism in that way, is that it empowers the person with the least amount of knowledge in thinking that they actually have a point, or that their fallacies are actually based in some reality. So when we are silent, when we avoid those conversations, when we avoid pain, we actually empower the person who's producing pain for other people. And so in avoiding pain, we typically do our best. And I think it's really interesting because when parents are chastising children, oftentimes the parent will demand or request that the child look at them as they're receiving the reprimand, which is contrary to how humans interact or how humans behave. Because we want to avoid pain, why would I look at my source of pain? Even at the doctor's office when they're giving you a shot, they use, they try to distract you as they do the, whatever the procedure is, particularly if it involves pain or perceived pain. And so we try to avoid those kinds of things. But what we have to understand is that our strength comes from pushing against the cognitive dissonance to better prepare ourselves for the next opportunity that we'll have to deal with race and racism. Another barrier, another problem that oftentimes comes up is this idea of isolation. And what that basically means, or how that plays out, is that people typically believe that, so they don't act, one, because they don't think that they have the power to do so. And secondly, when they don't act in the power that they have, they get kind of this depressive motivation. And so isolation, um, we have to get that out of our heads, because people are waiting and looking to us as leaders to help them out of situations, to free them in ways that we can. And so, and I'm sure that you have, just as I have, encountered situations that where bigotry or stereotypes or even discrimination is being expressed in some kind of way, and we have to make the decision: do we speak or do we not speak? Do we stand up? Do we not stand up? Is it safe or unsafe to do so? And so, in making those judgments and looking at those opportunities, we have to make the best judgment for ourselves. Now, having said that, most often what happens is that people make the decision based on the people around them, not realizing that the people around them are also waiting for someone to step up and speak out, so that they feel encouraged. And so it becomes extremely important that somebody speak up and stand up, because it sets the tone for all those who are to follow. And when we don't, or we're not feeling compelled to do that, then we keep other people. We don't encourage other people to move, and so therefore situations don't particularly change. And so that's an important thing to realize, is that as you speak up, someone is waiting for you and your voice and your consciousness to speak up. So I'm going to just take a minute here to entertain any questions, any thoughts that folks might have. Yep, so we're still on the conference call. The lines are still open. And so if you are, if you're still interested in joining us, please do. Like I said, the lines are open, and we're looking forward to engaging you in some conversations. All right. All right. So we'll continue with the webinar. Let me do one more thing before we continue. All right. So here we go. All right. All right. So I'm going to do this last piece, and then there are a couple of questions that folks had, so I'm trying to address those questions, and then I'll bring them back to the larger group. All right. So we'll come on back to the webinar. And so one of the questions is, So this individual's question was simply, how is it that um, we can be in a post-racial society and we still need to have these conversations? And so one of the things one of the ways I would answer is that we've never really dealt with our race issues in the first place. That we've had avatars, we've had people who have really helped us to kind of talk about it, but we haven't had real authentic conversations about race and racism that have pricked our hearts. We know that you can't legislate a lot of the. So although race is not real, we know that racism is. And racism is the systemic use of race as currency in an economic system, right? So if you look at neighborhoods and property values, a lot of those one could use race as a proxy to talk about the economic disadvantage of one group over another. And so until we've gotten into some core conversations about how to deal with those conversations about race and racism, we will continually be stuck in this loop of talking about race and racism. So there's that. So the next slide, basically, I wanted to give some tips for addressing race and racism and how do you talk about those things. So again, when we talk isolation, it makes you feel like you're by yourself. And what I would like to say is find allies, find friends, find people who can encourage you and who you can encourage to continually develop and talk about this. It's like a fine motor skill. The more time and the more thought you give into the deliberateness of the behavior, the more likely and the more impactful you'll be in being able to shape that, just like any other fine motor skill, into a piece of art. And that when we don't act, it causes us to lose the definition that fine motor skill practice can actually offer us. And so when you start on this journey, one thing that you notice, that at least I noticed for myself, is that emotions become strong. And why is it? Why do you think that is? Well, what I would suggest is that emotions are really attached to our identity. And I remember the betrayal that I felt from my in recognizing that my parents had taught me wrong. And so my brother and I oftentimes would fight. And so my parents decided that they would teach us that violence isn't a way to solve your problems. So they got us boxing gloves. And so my brother and I thought we were Sugar Ray Leonard or Muhammad Ali at the time. And so we would duke it out and get points and all this kind of stuff. But when I got out into the world and recognized that the way we fought in our house was not how you fight I was hugely disappointed, because the bully on the playground did not go by the rules that we used in our home. And so when we start having conversations about race and racism, and we start to discover things either about ourselves, about how we've lived, about how we've grown up, that aren't congruent with what we've known, strong feelings, strong emotions are the result of that digging and that probing. And so it's important to understand how we talk about those things, and to also make the distinction between talking about individual people and systemic problems. We know that individual racism is important to talk about. However, we also have to recognize that individuals play into systems. So systemic racism is extremely important to talk about as well. And so we have to find comfort in discomfort. We have to get to a place where where we start to recognize that there may be some things that we've missed, some ways that we've grown up, been taught, interacted with the world that may off. There may be different ways of looking at or defining or interacting with that information that our parents couldn't teach us because they didn't know. But as adults, the car that I drive has blind spots, and that those blind spots are not my fault, but they are my responsibility as I take to the road as a driver. And so we have to find comfort in discomfort. We have to talk about structural inequity, inequity such as racism, and it requires preparation and courage, both through for the facilitator and the group. Out of context, we do not know what to do with things that we've never experienced, right? So if I've never experienced anything, I don't know what to do with that information. Well, when in new situations or contexts, it is normal to feel discomfort or maladapted as new information and behaviors are required. So as you gain more exposure, you will develop more skills, more knowledge, and more adaptive mindsets. And this is where critical changes in behavior begin to happen when you've gotten that exposure. When you're using those fine motor skills over and over again, you become better adapt to, at least if not understand where people are coming from, being open to authentically listening to where they're coming from. It's also important, as we're having conversations about race and racism, to be vulnerable. So don't, so take this opportunity to talk about race and racism, and also understand that there are things that you may not know and things that you may not understand. But if you are vulnerable enough to listen, people will share with you very impactful ways that you can become a greater advocate. Now, one thing I like to clear up is that oftentimes people use the word ally to identify themselves with a particular cause. And what I would suggest is that we pause before we call ourselves an ally and wait for other people to call us an ally. I understand that Dr. Dre is a music producer and has sold lots of albums and been a part of lots of musical artists' lives. But Dr. Dre does not operate in a hospital. And why is that? Because Dr. Dre recognizes himself as a doctor, but not the medical community. And so until the people who you are an advocate for recognize you and call you an ally, you are just a zealous or a person who is an advocate for their cause, their group, or their mindsets. And so I caution people in using the term ally too quickly, because if I call myself an ally but nobody else does, then my allyship could be questioned. And so as you prepare to engage groups in difficult conversations, consider this question: What will a discussion about race and racism potentially expose about me? What about what can I be challenged? So what can I be challenged about? And what if I hear something that differs from my reality? How will I respond? Right. So if I hear something about my racial or ethnic group that flies in the face of what I know to be true, how will I respond if I'm trying to be vulnerable? And so there's some practices that we also have to recognize that are important in our ability to be an effective either leader of conversations or to effectively just have conversations about race and racism. And one of those is use yourself as the instrument of change. And so breathe and breathe in and breathe out, and let your yourself focused on the person before you. Attentive and active listening skills will take you further than knowing what to say or what to do with any particular individual. Also important to respond rather than to react. Reactions are very ego-based and switch the focus of discussion from the issue and turn it onto you. And responding requires one to stay fully present, listen, watch, and seek to understand the drives of their thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors. Keep in mind, all human behaviors are goal-directed, whether it achieves a goal or not. And so don't take yourself so seriously, and don't take the focus off of talking about race and racism and have the conversation now focus on you. So for example, lots of times people get emotional and tears well up or tears flow as a part of the conversation. Well, it's important to recognize that, but it's also important to recognize what that does to the conversation. Because when that happens, the focus typically shifts from the topic, and now we're trying to take care of the individual, and we lose focus on what we're really focused on. And so being prepared for those emotional, I just call them outbursts or overflow of emotions or realizations, it becomes important to keep those in context of the conversation so that we can actually further and advance learning. It's also important to acknowledge your own feelings and decide how you'll act on them. It's not important to know what your feelings will be. It's important to know how you will act on your feelings, particularly in a conversation about race and racism. It's also important to remain curious. Curiosity drives us to learn, and it should be in that spirit that we even have conversations about diversity. Also, we should recognize that perspective is extremely important because we all have differing perspectives and different perspectives. And you know, the last couple of pieces, and let me make sure I plug in. And so the last couple of pieces is asking ourselves, how is this particular conversation or the need for this conversation helpful? How is it helpful to have these conversations? What is it that will come out of this? Why are we even engaging in this conversation? Because if the sake is to just argue, then you can argue by yourself. What I mean is, don't waste groups or other people's times on activities that are just that have no goal in mind. And so, are you trying to teach someone something? Are you trying to learn something about another person? Those become important questions to ask. Another is it's also important to make these conversations meaningful for. It's important to have a context for these conversations, right? So why is it important to have these conversations? What are you trying to get out of the conversations? Are you learning? Are you teaching? Are you trying to grow personally? And now that you have that information, how will you use it? What context will that information fall in that you'll be able to actually use the information once you've had it, or once you've gotten exposure to that information? It's also important to foster a spirit of understanding. And when I say a spirit of understanding, what I'm referring to is the recognition that people have different ways of being, and there are experiences that I can't have or I can't relate to, but I'm seeking to understand people's motivation in their own experiences and listening to their experiences through their own words. And that becomes important because if we start out with our own agendas, then we are likely to miss the whole conversation um, as we try to engage with folks. And so we can't have our own agendas. Um, agendas, questions that come out of our agenda are actually advice, and people don't want to have advice when we're talking about conversations about race and racism. Blame, fault, and guilt never motivate people. It is these advice questions or challenges that we have uh, that we typically have. Sometimes they are a guise of another agenda. And so just making sure what is our intention, what is our rationale for having this conversation on race and racism. Lastly, I'd like to give you a couple of resources that can help you kind of explore all of those points that we talked about. And, you know, the tolerance.org website, or Teaching Tolerance, has a number of really great tools for personal and professional development around how to talk about race and racism. And so I'd encourage you to go to that site. You can also go to ceupartners.org as a resource. You can go to Andre Cohen, and it's AndreKoen.com as a resource for advancing, you know, the conversations about race and racism, and constantly expose yourself into new and different situations as a resource. There are tons of folks in your own community, and it's really interesting because even in communities where people seem to be alike, there is diversity there as well. Our next session, although we talked a little bit about race and racism, and that race is an organizing tool used by governments to kind of control their populace, a social construct, if you will, and that racism is the economic system by which race is currency. So although we've talked about those things, the next topic that we'll start talking about, or the next area of this kind of diversity montage that we'll start talking about, is this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So so that will be our next session, that we'll see you in this space for that next session. For those of you who've had some questions, I tried to identify those and address those in the chat room. There are a couple of people who said they didn't want their questions addressed out loud, so I tried to honor that as best I could. So there is that. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see my contact information. If you ever want to contact us via our conference call, feel free to give us a call at 651-300-5500. That's 651-300-5500. Or you can reach me at andre@amhorizons.com, or andre.cohen@alfredadler.edu. If there's anything else that we can do for you, I wanted to mention, those of you who are looking for CEUs, please email me, and we will make sure that you get those CEUs that you've earned by being a part of this webinar. So we look forward to seeing who you become, and we're so glad that you were able to spend this time with us, and I look forward to seeing you the next time. Thanks. Have a great day. And this is Andre Cohen. Goodbye.